Stop. Before you watch another video about Alexander the Great, forget everything you think you know. This is not the story of a hero. This is not the story of a villain either. This is the story of a man who, by the age of 30, had marched an army further than any human being in recorded history had ever marched an army before, who never lost a single battle, not one, in 11 years of continuous warfare, who burned the greatest city in the ancient world to the ground in a single night, and then spent the rest of his life trying to become the very people he had conquered, who died at 32, in a foreign city, far from home, and whispered with his last breath a single phrase that would plunge half the known world into 40 years of war. To the strongest. Tonight, for the next 3 hours, we tell the complete story. Every battle, every betrayal, every mile, from a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world to the banks of a river in India where his own men, the most loyal soldiers in human history, finally said no. This is Alexander the Great, and almost everything you've heard about him is only half the story. Did you know? Number 1. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, was so wild that no one in his father's court could ride him. Alexander was 13 years old. He noticed something nobody else had noticed. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. He turned the horse to face the sun, so the shadow fell behind him, and calmly mounted. His father Philip is said to have wept and told him, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." Alexander was 13. He would spend the rest of his life proving his father right. Part 1. The world that made him. To understand Alexander, you cannot start with Alexander. You have to start with a wound. Not a physical wound, though there would be plenty of those later. A cultural wound. A wound to pride. The kind of wound that, in certain kinds of men, does not heal. It festers. It becomes ambition. In the 4th century BCE, the Greek world was not a single nation. It was a constellation of fiercely independent city-states. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, each with its own government, its own army, its own gods, its own sense of superiority over everyone else. And to every one of these city-states, the kingdom of Macedonia, in the rugged hills to the north, was barely Greek at all. The Macedonians spoke a dialect the southern Greeks found almost comical. Their kings married multiple wives in a manner the city-states considered barbaric. Their nobles hunted, drank, and fought with a roughness that Athenian philosophers described, with thinly veiled contempt, as northern. When Macedonian ambassadors came south to Athens or Thebes, they were tolerated, rarely respected. This was the world Alexander was born into in 356 BCE, in the Macedonian capital of Pella, a world where his own people were considered, by the most sophisticated civilization on earth, to be something close to barbarians who happened to speak a related language. His mother, Olympias, never let him forget where he came from, or what he might become. Olympias was a princess of Epirus, a fiercely intelligent, and by all contemporary accounts deeply intense woman who practiced the mystery cults of Dionysus, kept snakes as religious companions, and told her son from the earliest age that his true father was not Philip of Macedon. His true father, she said, was Zeus himself. Whether Olympias actually believed this or whether it was political theater designed to elevate her son above rival claimants to the throne, historians still debate. What is not in debate is the effect it had on a brilliant, ambitious child. Alexander grew up genuinely uncertain whether he was fully mortal. He would spend his entire life trying to find out. His father, Philip II, was one of the most underrated political and military geniuses of the ancient world, overshadowed in popular memory entirely by his son, but in his own right one of history's great state builders. When Philip came to the Macedonian throne in 359 BCE, the kingdom was in chaos, surrounded by hostile tribes, recently defeated in battle, its own nobility constantly conspiring against the crown. Within 20 years, Philip had transformed this fractured kingdom into the single most powerful military state in the Mediterranean world. He did it through a combination of military innovation, ruthless diplomacy, and sheer force of will. Militarily, Philip created something the Greek world had never seen: the Macedonian phalanx, armed with the sarissa, a spear nearly 18 feet long, far longer than the spears used by traditional Greek hoplites. A formation of men carrying these weapons created a wall of iron points that virtually no infantry force could break through directly. He combined this phalanx with heavy cavalry, the companions, recruited from Macedonia's noble families, creating a tactical system where the phalanx would hold an enemy line in place while the cavalry delivered a decisive flanking blow. It was, in essence, the hammer and anvil that Alexander would later use to conquer half the known world. Philip invented it. Alexander perfected it. Diplomatically, Philip was equally formidable. He married strategically, 7 or 8 wives over his lifetime, each marriage sealing an alliance with a different kingdom or tribe. He bribed when bribery worked. He fought when fighting was necessary. And slowly, methodically, he brought first Macedonia, then the surrounding regions, then ultimately the southern Greek city-states themselves under his control. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, the two greatest military powers of southern Greece, and effectively ended 4 centuries of Greek city-state independence. Alexander, 18 years old, commanded the Macedonian left wing in that battle and led the decisive cavalry charge that broke the elite Theban sacred band. 300 warriors, bound in pairs by oaths of love and loyalty, who had never before been defeated in battle. They were defeated that day. Almost all of them died where they stood, refusing to break formation even as the battle was lost. Alexander, witnessing this, reportedly wept at the sight of their courage. It was his first great victory. It would not be his last. Did you know? Number 2. The Sacred Band of Thebes, the elite unit Alexander helped destroy at Chaeronea, was composed of 150 pairs of male lovers. The ancient Greeks believed that soldiers fighting beside their lovers would fight with greater courage, since neither man would want to appear cowardly in front of the person he loved most. For decades, the sacred band was considered unbeatable, until Philip and Alexander's new Macedonian tactics proved otherwise. After the battle, Philip is said to have wept when he saw their bodies, arranged in pairs, exactly as they had fought, exactly as they had died. Part 2. The Education of a Conqueror. In 343 BCE, when Alexander was 13 years old, Philip made a decision that would shape the intellectual foundations of the man who would later conquer the known world. He hired a tutor, not just any tutor, Aristotle, already, even at this relatively early stage of his career, recognized as one of the most brilliant minds in the Greek world, a former student of Plato, who had himself studied under Socrates. Philip built a school for Aristotle at a place called Mysa, in the gardens and shaded walkways of a sanctuary dedicated to the nymphs. And there, for the next 3 years, Alexander and a small group of other young Macedonian nobles received an education unlike anything else in the ancient world. Aristotle taught Alexander logic, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, and the natural sciences. He taught him medicine, knowledge that Alexander would later use to treat his own wounded soldiers on campaign. He taught him botany and zoology, Alexander would later send specimens of exotic plants and animals back to Aristotle from every corner of his expanding empire, contributing directly to the foundations of Western natural science. But more than any specific subject, Aristotle instilled in Alexander a particular way of thinking about the world: rational, systematic, curious, always asking why rather than simply accepting what was. Alexander carried a personal copy of Homer's Iliad for the rest of his life, annotated, according to ancient sources, by Aristotle himself, and kept under his pillow alongside a dagger wherever he slept. Even on campaign deep in Asia, he considered Achilles, the doomed hero of the Iliad, his personal model and ancestor. His mother's family claimed direct descent from the Trojan War hero, another piece of the mythological architecture that Alexander built around his own identity from childhood. This is a crucial thing to understand about Alexander that is often lost in simplified accounts of his life. He was not simply a brilliant general. He was a deeply, almost obsessively literary and philosophical man, who saw his own life unfolding as a kind of epic narrative, who measured himself constantly against the heroes of Homer, and who seems to have genuinely believed, at some level, that he was destined to become one of them. This self-conception, half-rational philosopher king in the Aristotelian mold, half-mythic hero descended from gods, would drive both the most brilliant and the most troubling decisions of his later life. In 336 BCE, when Alexander was 20 years old, his father Philip was assassinated at the wedding of Alexander's sister, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards in circumstances that remain murky to this day. Some ancient sources suggest a personal grievance. Others hint, without quite saying so directly, that Olympias, or even Alexander himself, may have had some involvement in clearing his path to the throne. The truth has never been established with certainty. What is certain is what happened next. Alexander moved with a speed and ruthlessness that immediately silenced any doubts about his readiness to rule. Rival claimants to the throne were executed. Potential threats among the Macedonian nobility were eliminated. Within weeks, Alexander had secured his position as king of Macedonia. He was 20 years old, and he had inherited not just a throne, but a war his father had spent his entire life preparing for and would never live to fight: the invasion of the Persian Empire. Did you know? Number 3. When news of Philip's assassination reached the southern Greek city-states, many of them celebrated, believing Macedonian power would now collapse under an inexperienced 20-year-old king. The city of Thebes rose in open rebellion. Alexander's response was the fastest forced march in ancient military history up to that point, covering roughly 240 miles in just over a week, appearing outside the walls of Thebes before anyone believed it was possible. He gave the city a chance to surrender. They refused. What happened next would define how the entire Greek world understood the new king of Macedonia. Part 3. The Destruction of Thebes. The siege and destruction of Thebes in 335 BCE is one of the most controversial episodes in Alexander's entire career, and one that modern audiences, raised on a more heroic version of his story, often don't hear about in detail. Thebes was one of the great cities of Greece, home to the philosopher Pindar, a founding member of the alliance that had fought the Persians at the Battle of Plataea a century and a half earlier, a city with a proud, ancient lineage stretching back, in legend, to the hero Cadmus and the dragon's teeth from which the first Thebans were said to have sprung. When the city rebelled against Macedonian rule, believing the young new king would be too inexperienced or too distracted to respond effectively, Alexander proved them catastrophically wrong. After a brief siege, the city fell, and Alexander made a decision that would echo through the rest of his career. He destroyed it, not partially, not symbolically. Completely. Every building was razed except the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, which Alexander specifically ordered spared. A gesture, perhaps, toward the idea that even in total destruction, art and the gods deserved respect. Of the city's population, those who were not killed in the fighting, estimated at somewhere between 6 and 30,000 people, depending on the ancient source, were sold into slavery. The other Greek city-states were horrified, and that horror was, in significant part, the point. Alexander needed the rest of Greece to understand, immediately and unambiguously, that the new king of Macedonia would tolerate no rebellion. He needed his rear secure before he turned east to fight Persia. The destruction of Thebes was not an act of uncontrolled rage. Ancient sources suggest it was a calculated, almost surgical act of political terror, designed to ensure that no other Greek city would consider rebellion while his army marched thousands of miles away. It worked. No Greek city-state seriously challenged Macedonian authority again during Alexander's lifetime, but it reveals something essential about the man who would later spend a decade attempting, with what appears to be genuine sincerity, to build a multicultural empire founded on the unity of conquered and conqueror. The same Alexander who would weep at the courage of his defeated enemies, who would marry a Persian princess and adopt Persian customs, who would order the dead of his enemies buried with full honors. This was also a man capable of erasing an entire city from the map when he judged it strategically necessary. He contained both of these men within himself for his entire life. Understanding Alexander means refusing to simplify him into only one or the other. Did you know? Number 4. A century after Alexander destroyed Thebes, his successors began rebuilding it, but the city never fully recovered its former glory. Centuries later, the Roman writer Pausanias, touring Greece, described Thebes as a melancholy shadow of what it had once been, a permanent reminder of what happened to those who underestimated the speed and ruthlessness of Macedonian power. Part 4. Crossing into Asia. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander led an army of roughly 40,000 men across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, the same waters where, in Greek mythology, the hero Leander had swum each night to visit his lover Hero. Ancient sources describe Alexander, upon landing on the Asian shore, hurling his spear into the ground and declaring he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods, won by the spear, a deliberate piece of political theater establishing, from his very first moment on Persian soil, the terms on which he intended to claim this entire continent. He then made a detour that revealed, again, the depth of his identification with the heroic past. He traveled to the site of ancient Troy, where, according to legend, Achilles had fought and died 1,000 years earlier. There, Alexander ran naked around the tomb of Achilles in the traditional Greek manner of honoring a hero, anointed the tomb with oil, and placed a wreath upon it. His companion Hyphasis performed the same ritual at the nearby tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, whose death in the Iliad drives Achilles into the rage that defines the entire epic. The parallel was not subtle. Alexander was positioning himself, quite deliberately, as a new Achilles, embarking on a new Trojan War, except this time, against the entire Persian Empire, and this time, intending to win completely rather than simply sack a single city. The Persian Empire that Alexander was about to invade was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful state the world had ever seen, stretching from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey in the west to the Indus River in modern Pakistan in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the deserts of Egypt and Arabia in the south. The Achaemenid Persian Empire controlled, by some estimates, nearly half the population of the entire planet at the time. Its king, Darius III, could call upon resources, soldiers, gold, horses, supplies, that dwarfed anything available to the king of a small Macedonian kingdom. On paper, it should not have been close. Alexander's first major battle on Asian soil came at the Granicus River, where a Persian force under several regional satraps, provincial governors, attempted to stop the Macedonian advance before it could penetrate further into Anatolia. The battle nearly killed Alexander before his campaign had truly begun. Ancient sources described him leading the cavalry charge across the river personally, and at one point being struck on the helmet by an axe wielded by a Persian nobleman, with the blow only failing to kill him because his companion Cletus, who would, in a tragic irony, later die at Alexander's own hand in a drunken argument, cut off the attacker's arm at the critical moment. The Macedonians won decisively, and the pattern that would define the entire Persian campaign was established: superior tactics, superior cavalry, and a king who led from the most dangerous position on the battlefield, repeatedly risking his own life in a way that no rational military theorist would advise, but which had a profound psychological effect on both his own soldiers and his enemies. An army whose king fights in the front rank fights differently than an army whose king watches from a safe distance. If this story is carrying you somewhere peaceful tonight, if you're finding yourself drawn into the world of Alexander the Great, take a moment to subscribe to Sleep and History and ring the bell. We have dozens more stories like this one, and your support helps us keep making them. Now, let's continue the journey. Did you know? Number 5. Alexander founded over 20 cities during his campaigns, almost all of them named Alexandria after himself. Most have vanished or been absorbed into later settlements, but Alexandria in Egypt became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the Great Library, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and centuries later, to Cleopatra herself. It remains a major city today, nearly 2,350 years after its founding. Part 5. The Gordian Knot. As Alexander's army moved deeper into Asia Minor through 334 and 333 BCE, securing city after city, sometimes through battle and sometimes through negotiated surrender, he arrived at the city of Gordium, in central Anatolia. There, in the temple of Zeus, sat an ancient wagon, its yoke bound to the pole with an intricate, impossibly tangled knot of cornel bark. According to local legend, this was the wagon of the legendary King Midas's father Gordius, and an oracle had declared that whoever could untie the knot would become ruler of all Asia. For generations, the knot had defeated every attempt to loosen it. What Alexander did next has become one of the most famous anecdotes of the ancient world, though, like much about Alexander, ancient sources differ on exactly what happened. According to the most common version, Alexander examined the knot, found no visible end to work with, and simply drew his sword and sliced through it in a single stroke. Problem solved. Prophecy fulfilled. By brute force rather than patient unraveling. A second, less flattering tradition suggests he simply found the pin that held the yoke to the pole and pulled it out, allowing the knot to fall away without needing to be cut at all. A more clever but less dramatically satisfying solution. Whichever version is true, the story has survived for over 2,000 years as a perfect illustration of Alexander's approach to problems of every kind. When faced with something seemingly impossible to solve through conventional means, find a way to solve it decisively, even if that means ignoring the rules everyone else assumed applied. It is the origin of the modern English phrase cutting the Gordian knot, meaning to solve a complicated problem through a bold, decisive action rather than painstaking effort. 2,300 years later, We are still using a phrase coined to describe a 22-year-old king slicing through a piece of rope in a small Anatolian temple. That is the strange, persistent power of the Alexander legend. Details from his life have embedded themselves so deeply into the language and thought of Western civilization that most people who use them have no idea of their origin. Did you know? Number 6. The phrase cutting the Gordian knot is just one of dozens of expressions, concepts, and cultural touchstones that trace directly back to Alexander's life and campaigns. The very concept of a world conqueror, a single individual whose ambition encompasses literally the entire known world, enters Western political thought primarily through Alexander. Julius Caesar reportedly wept when he read of Alexander's accomplishments, lamenting that he had achieved so little by the same age. Napoleon Bonaparte studied Alexander's campaigns in detail and consciously modeled aspects of his own military career on them. Few individuals in human history have cast as long a shadow across the centuries that followed them. Part 6. The Battle of Issus. In the autumn of 333 BCE, Alexander finally met King Darius III of Persia in person on the battlefield, near the town of Issus in what is now southeastern Turkey, close to the modern Syrian border. The battle that followed would become one of the most studied military engagements in ancient history, not simply for its outcome, but for what it revealed about the gap between Alexander's tactical genius and even the most sophisticated resources the largest empire on earth could deploy against him. Darius had assembled an enormous force. Ancient sources, prone to exaggeration, claim numbers ranging from 100,000 to over 500,000 men, though modern historians generally consider these figures wildly inflated and estimate the actual Persian force at perhaps 100,000, still vastly outnumbering Alexander's army of roughly 40,000. But Darius made a critical strategic error. Believing he could trap Alexander's smaller force against the coast, he positioned his massive army on a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea, a location that, ironically, neutralized his greatest advantage, his overwhelming numbers, by preventing him from deploying his full force effectively. Alexander recognized the opportunity instantly. In the cramped terrain, the battle became less about which side had more soldiers and more about which side could fight with greater tactical coordination and discipline within the available space. Alexander personally led the decisive cavalry charge against the Persian left flank, driving directly toward the position where Darius himself commanded the battle from an elevated chariot. What happened next has become legendary, repeated and embellished in countless ancient and modern accounts. As Alexander's cavalry broke through toward the Persian king's position, Darius, according to most ancient sources, lost his nerve and fled the battlefield, abandoning his army, his command, and, in his haste, his own family, his mother, his wife, and his children were captured in the Persian camp. Without their king, the massive Persian army collapsed into chaos and was routed. What Alexander did with Darius's captured family reveals, once again, the complexity of his character. He did not humiliate them. He did not use them as hostages for political leverage in the brutal manner that would have been entirely conventional for the era. Instead, he treated them with extraordinary courtesy, visiting Darius's mother personally, ensuring she understood her family would be protected and treated according to royal dignity, and reportedly even allowing Darius's wife, renowned as one of the most beautiful women in the Persian Empire, to live unmolested under his protection. When Darius eventually learned of this treatment, ancient sources claim he was moved to genuine gratitude, reportedly praying that if he himself could not retain the Persian throne, he hoped the gods would grant it to no one but Alexander. Whether this anecdote is historically accurate or a later embellishment designed to flatter Alexander's reputation for chivalry, it captures something real about how Alexander approached conquest from very early in his campaign, not simply as destruction, but as a transfer of legitimate authority, in which the conquered deserved respect, even reverence, rather than mere subjugation. This was not how conquerors typically behaved in the ancient world. It was, in many ways, revolutionary, and it would become increasingly important as Alexander pushed deeper into Asia and began to understand that holding an empire this vast would require far more than military force alone. Did you know? Number 7. After the Battle of Issus, Alexander captured not just Darius's family but the Persian king's personal luxury tent and traveling equipment, ornate, beyond anything the Macedonians had ever seen. When Alexander first entered the tent and saw the golden bathing vessels, the perfumes, and the magnificence of even Darius's traveling quarters, he is said to have remarked to his companions, "So this, it seems, is what it means to be a king." It was perhaps the first moment Alexander truly understood the scale of the world he was attempting to conquer, and the scale of the transformation that conquering it would eventually require of him. Part 7. The Siege of Tyre. After his victory at Issus, Alexander faced a critical strategic decision. Darius had fled east, regrouping to raise a new, even larger army. The obvious move, the move any conventional general would have made, was to pursue him immediately and finish the war while the Persian king was still vulnerable and disorganized. Alexander did something else entirely. He turned south, toward the Mediterranean coast of Phoenicia and Egypt, territory that, on the surface, had nothing directly to do with defeating the Persian army. His reasoning was characteristically several moves ahead of everyone around him. The Persian navy, still largely intact despite the land defeat at Issus, remained a serious threat. As long as Persian ships controlled the eastern Mediterranean, they could threaten Alexander's supply lines back to Greece, potentially even land troops behind his army to cut off his retreat, or stir up rebellion among the Greek city-states he had only recently subdued. Alexander's solution was as audacious as it was strategically brilliant. Rather than trying to defeat the Persian navy at sea, where Macedonia had no real advantage, he would simply eliminate every port the Persian fleet depended on along the coast, starving it of harbors until it had nowhere left to operate from. City after Phoenician city fell into line, some through negotiation, some through brief sieges. Then he reached Tyre. Tyre was unlike any of the other coastal cities, built on an island roughly half a mile from the mainland, protected by walls rising directly from the sea. Possessing its own substantial fleet, the city had withstood sieges for centuries, including, according to tradition, a 13-year siege by the Babylonians that had ultimately failed to take it by force. The Tyrians, confident in their island fortress, refused Alexander's demand to allow Macedonian forces to enter the city to make religious sacrifices, a demand that was, transparently, a test of submission rather than genuine religious necessity. Alexander's response was one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of ancient military history. Lacking a fleet capable of directly challenging the Tyrian navy, he ordered his army to build a causeway, an artificial land bridge, directly across the half-mile of open sea separating the mainland from the island city. It took 7 months. His engineers used the rubble of the abandoned mainland settlement of Old Tyre as raw material, driving pilings into the sea, building up a structure wide enough to support siege towers and battering rams, all while under constant harassment from Tyrian ships and defenders who understood perfectly well what Alexander was attempting and fought desperately to stop it. The Tyrians sent fireships against the causeway, destroying completed sections and forcing Alexander's engineers to begin again. They conducted raids by sea against the work parties. They mocked the Macedonians from their walls, reportedly at one point hauling captured sailors onto the battlements and executing them in full view of Alexander's army, throwing their bodies into the sea as a deliberate provocation. Alexander persisted. When the causeway alone proved insufficient, he assembled a fleet from the now loyal Phoenician cities he had already subdued, a fleet that, combined with naval forces from Cyprus, finally gave him the maritime power to challenge Tyre's navy directly and establish a blockade. The city finally fell in the summer of 332 BCE, after a siege of approximately 7 months, one of the longest and most costly engagements of Alexander's entire career. The aftermath was brutal. Ancient sources describe several thousand Tyrians killed in the final assault, and several thousand more, perhaps as many as 30,000, according to some accounts, sold into slavery as punishment for the city's prolonged resistance and the execution of captured Macedonian sailors. It was, like the destruction of Thebes years earlier, a calculated demonstration. Resistance to Alexander, however prolonged, however skillfully conducted, would ultimately fail, and the cost of that resistance would be severe. The message was received. As Alexander continued south toward Egypt, city after city along his path chose surrender over the fate that had befallen Tyre. Did you know? Number 8. The causeway Alexander's army built to reach Tyre never washed away. Over the following centuries, sediment continued to accumulate around the original structure, and what was once a narrow military engineering project gradually widened into a permanent land bridge. Today, the location of ancient Tyre is no longer an island at all. It is a peninsula, permanently connected to the Lebanese mainland, a direct and lasting physical consequence of a military decision made by a 24-year-old king in 332 BCE. The geography of an entire stretch of Mediterranean coastline was altered by a siege, and remains altered, visibly, more than 2,000 years later. Part 8. Egypt and the Oracle of Siwa. After the fall of Tyre, Alexander's path to Egypt was largely unopposed. The Egyptians, who had endured roughly 2 centuries of intermittent Persian rule marked by periodic revolts and what Egyptian sources describe as a deep contempt from Persian administrators for native Egyptian religion and culture, had little loyalty left to defend. When Alexander arrived in 332 BCE, he was welcomed not as a foreign conqueror but, in a remarkable inversion of the usual dynamics of conquest, as a liberator. The Egyptian priesthood, recognizing an opportunity to restore the traditional relationship between pharaoh and temple that Persian rule had disrupted, crowned Alexander pharaoh of Egypt in the ancient capital of Memphis, formally incorporating him into more than 2,000 years of Egyptian religious and political tradition. It was here, during his time in Egypt, that Alexander made one of the most consequential decisions of his entire campaign. Not a military decision, but a journey undertaken for reasons that remain, even now, somewhat mysterious. He traveled to the oracle of the god Amun at the remote oasis of Siwa, deep in the western desert, a journey of several hundred miles across some of the most hostile terrain in the ancient world. Ancient sources describe the expedition as nearly disastrous. The small party reportedly became lost in sandstorms and ran perilously low on water before being guided to safety, according to legend, by ravens or talking serpents sent by the gods themselves to lead them to the oasis. What happened at the oracle itself remains genuinely unclear. Alexander entered the sanctuary alone, spoke privately with the priests, and emerged without ever fully revealing the contents of the prophecy he received, a silence that, characteristically, only amplified the mystique surrounding the visit. What is known as the effect it had. The Egyptian priests, in their traditional role of confirming the divine status of the pharaoh, apparently addressed Alexander using language equating him with the son of Amun, a title with deep resonance in Egyptian religious tradition, where Amun was frequently identified with the Greek god Zeus. For Alexander, raised by a mother who had told him since childhood that his true father was Zeus himself, this Egyptian confirmation of semi-divine status was profoundly significant, whether he fully believed it himself, used it as useful political theater to strengthen his authority among conquered peoples accustomed to god-kings, or experienced some genuine, complicated mixture of both. From this point forward, the question of Alexander's divinity, was he a man, a hero, or something closer to a god, would follow him for the remainder of his life and would become an increasingly central, increasingly controversial element of how he understood and presented his own authority. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander made one further decision whose consequences would far outlast his own brief life. On the Mediterranean coast, near a small fishing village, he personally selected the site for a new city, reportedly laying out its initial street plan himself using barley flour because no chalk was available. He named it, in the pattern that would repeat across his entire empire, after himself. Alexander could not have known, standing on that stretch of Egyptian coastline in 331 BCE, that Alexandria would become one of the great cities of human civilization, a center of learning, science, and culture that would outlast not just his own empire but the Roman Empire that came after it, a city whose great library would attempt, for centuries, to collect the entire accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, a city that, nearly 2,500 years later, remains one of the major metropolitan centers of the Mediterranean. Of all the more than 20 cities Alexander founded during his decade of conquest, Alexandria alone would achieve a permanence and significance that rivaled, and in some ways exceeded, his own military accomplishments. Did you know? Number 9. Alexander's body, after his death, was eventually brought to Alexandria and interred there in an elaborate tomb that became, for centuries, one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the ancient Mediterranean world. Julius Caesar visited it. The Roman Emperor Augustus visited it and reportedly accidentally broke off a piece of the nose from Alexander's preserved body while examining it too closely. And then, sometime in late antiquity, the location of the tomb was lost. Despite centuries of searching by archaeologists, treasure hunters, and historians, the final resting place of one of history's most famous individuals has never been rediscovered. It remains, to this day, one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. Somewhere beneath the modern city of Alexandria, the tomb of Alexander the Great is still waiting to be found. Part 9. Gaugamela, the Final Reckoning. By the autumn of 331 BCE, Darius III had spent nearly 2 years rebuilding his shattered army, drawing on the full resources of an empire that, despite its losses at Issus and the fall of its Mediterranean territories, still controlled vast regions stretching deep into Central Asia. He selected his battlefield with extreme care this time, a wide, flat plain near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, specifically chosen because its open terrain would allow him to deploy his full numerical superiority without the geographical constraints that had crippled his forces at Issus. Darius even had sections of the battlefield deliberately leveled and cleared of obstacles to ensure his scythed chariots, war chariots fitted with blades projecting from their wheels, designed to cut through infantry formations, could operate at maximum effectiveness. Ancient sources, again prone to exaggeration, claim Darius assembled an army of anywhere from 200,000 to over 1 million men. Modern historians generally estimate the actual figure at somewhere between 50 and 100,000 combat troops, though even at the more conservative end of this range, Darius's force significantly outnumbered Alexander's roughly 47,000 men. What Darius could not account for was Alexander's tactical imagination. As the two armies faced each other across the plain, Alexander did something that defied every conventional expectation. Rather than launching a direct assault or attempting to match the Persian line's full width, he advanced his forces at an oblique angle, gradually drawing Darius's left flank further and further from the carefully prepared, leveled ground that favored the Persian chariots and cavalry. This maneuver created exactly what Alexander needed: gaps and disorganization within the Persian formation as commanders attempted to adjust to the unexpected movement. When he identified a critical weakness opening in the Persian center, directly in front of Darius's own position, Alexander led his companion cavalry in the same kind of decisive, personally led charge that had broken the Persian line at Issus. The wedge of Macedonian cavalry drove directly toward Darius's chariot, and once again, as he had at Issus, Darius's nerve broke. Facing the very real possibility of being killed or captured in the chaos, the King of Kings abandoned his army a second time and fled the battlefield. The psychological effect on the rest of the Persian forces was catastrophic. Without their king, command and coordination collapsed, and what had been the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled disintegrated into a rout. The Battle of Gaugamela effectively ended the Achaemenid Persian Empire as a unified political entity. Darius would survive for almost another year, fleeing eastward, attempting to rally support among the empire's eastern provinces. But he would never again command an army capable of meeting Alexander in open battle. The empire that had stood, by this point, for over 200 years, that had once, under Darius's predecessors, conquered Egypt, Babylon, and threatened to absorb the Greek city-states themselves, had been broken in a single afternoon by a Macedonian king not yet 25 years old. Did you know? Number 10. After the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander marched to Babylon, one of the oldest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world, with walls so vast that ancient writers claimed multiple chariots could race side by side along their top. Rather than sacking the city as a defeated enemy capital, Alexander entered Babylon in a carefully staged ceremonial procession, deliberately presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror but as the legitimate successor to the Babylonian throne. He ordered the restoration of temples that earlier Persian kings had damaged or neglected, won significant goodwill from the Babylonian priesthood, and began, for the first time, seriously incorporating conquered administrators into his governing structure rather than simply replacing them wholesale with Macedonians. It was an early, clear signal of the governing philosophy that would increasingly define the second half of Alexander's career. Conquest was only the first step. Holding an empire this vast would require something far more sophisticated than military force alone. Part 10. Persepolis and the burning of an empire. From Babylon, Alexander continued deeper into the Persian heartland, eventually arriving at Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital built by generations of Persian kings, a city of palaces, treasuries, and monumental architecture that represented, more than any other single location, the accumulated wealth and splendor of 2 centuries of Persian imperial power. The wealth Alexander discovered there was almost incomprehensible. Ancient sources describe treasuries containing such vast quantities of gold and silver that it reportedly required something in the range of 10,000 pairs of mules and 5,000 camels simply to transport the accumulated wealth of Persepolis alone back toward Macedonian-controlled territory. For several months, Alexander occupied the city, apparently undecided about its ultimate fate. Then, during a night of celebration, ancient sources differ on exactly how the events unfolded, with some suggesting the decision was made in a moment of drunken impulse during a feast, possibly at the urging of an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who reportedly argued the city should be burned as revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens a century and a half earlier. Alexander ordered Persepolis put to the torch. The magnificent palace complex, representing generations of Persian artistic and architectural achievement, was destroyed. Historians have debated the motivations behind this decision for over 2,000 years. Was it genuine impulsive drunken excess, later regretted? Was it, as some ancient sources suggest, a calculated political statement, deliberately announcing the symbolic end of the Persian Empire by destroying its most sacred ceremonial center? Was it revenge, fulfilling the stated justification for the entire Greek invasion of Persia in the first place? Punishment for Xerxes' burning of Athens generations earlier? The truth likely contains elements of all of these explanations. What is clear is that the destruction of Persepolis marked a turning point, both practically, in that it eliminated any possibility of Alexander ruling as a direct continuation of the existing Persian monarchical structure from its traditional ceremonial center, and symbolically, in that it represented the definitive, irreversible end of the Achaemenid Persian Empire as it had existed for 2 centuries. What would come next? Alexander's own vision of empire, increasingly blending Macedonian, Greek, and Persian elements into something genuinely new, was still being worked out, even by Alexander himself, in real time, as his army continued pressing eastward into territories no Macedonian or Greek army had ever approached. If you find yourself drawn deeper into Alexander's story as the night goes on, remember that sleep and history has many more journeys like this one waiting for you. A quiet subscribe and a tap of the bell helps these stories keep reaching people who, like you, find history the most peaceful way to drift off to sleep. Now, deeper into Asia we go. Did you know? Number 11. Darius III, having fled eastward after Gaugamela, was eventually betrayed and assassinated by his own satraps in the summer of 330 BCE. Persian nobles who had concluded that the great king had become more a liability than an asset in their attempts to resist Alexander's advance. When Alexander finally caught up with the fleeing remnants of the Persian court, he found Darius already dead or dying, abandoned in a wagon. Alexander reportedly covered the body with his own cloak and later arranged for Darius to be buried with full royal honors in the traditional tombs of the Persian kings, a final, characteristic gesture of respect toward the empire and the man he had spent years fighting to destroy. He then declared himself, with the last legitimate claimant to the Persian throne now dead, the rightful king of kings, formally, legally, in his own understanding, the new ruler of the entire Persian Empire, not merely its conqueror. Part 11. The War That Wouldn't End. With Darius dead, any conventional understanding of the Persian campaign would suggest the war was over. Alexander had defeated the great king in open battle twice, occupied the empire's major cities, captured its treasuries, and now held the only plausible claim to legitimate succession. But the eastern satraps, the provincial governors who controlled the vast, remote territories of Bactria and Sogdiana, in what is now Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, had no intention of simply accepting Macedonian rule. What followed was nearly 3 years of the most grueling, frustrating guerrilla warfare of Alexander's entire career, a stark contrast to the decisive, set-piece battles that had characterized the conquest of the core Persian territories. The terrain itself became as much an enemy as the Bactrian and Sogdian resistance fighters. Alexander's army, trained and equipped for the relatively predictable warfare of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world, found itself struggling through some of the most punishing geography on earth. The high passes of the Hindu Kush Mountains, scorching deserts, and a network of fortified mountain strongholds that local commanders used to mount hit-and-run attacks before melting back into terrain the Macedonians did not know and could not easily navigate. One particular siege, at a seemingly impregnable mountain fortress known as the Sogdian Rock, became legendary for the manner of its resolution. The local commander, confident in his fortress's inaccessibility, reportedly mocked Alexander's demand for surrender by suggesting the Macedonians would need soldiers with wings to take the position. Alexander offered substantial rewards to any soldiers willing to attempt a night climb up the fortress's sheer cliff face using ropes and metal tent pegs as makeshift climbing equipment. Several hundred men volunteered, and a number of them succeeded in scaling the supposedly unclimbable rock face, appearing above the fortress at dawn. The shock of seeing Macedonian soldiers materialize on ground believed completely inaccessible was enough to break the defenders' resolve without further fighting. The fortress surrendered. It was during this brutal Bactrian campaign that Alexander made a decision that would have lasting political and personal consequences. In 327 BCE, he married Roxana, the daughter of a local Bactrian nobleman. Reportedly after seeing her at a banquet and being immediately struck by her beauty. Whatever the romantic elements of the story, the political calculation was equally clear. Marrying into the local nobility offered a path toward genuine, lasting integration with the conquered populations of the Eastern Empire, rather than relying purely on military occupation. A strategy consistent with the increasingly sophisticated approach to governance Alexander had been developing since his early gestures of respect toward Darius's captured family years earlier. His Macedonian veterans, however, were deeply unsettled. A king who increasingly dressed in elements of Persian royal costume, who adopted Persian court ceremonies including proskynesis, a ritual gesture of prostration before the king that Macedonians considered appropriate only for worshipping gods, never for honoring a fellow mortal, however exalted, and who had now married a Bactrian princess rather than a Macedonian or Greek noblewoman, seemed, to many of his oldest companions, to be transforming into something they no longer recognized. This tension, between Alexander's genuine, evolving vision of a unified, multicultural empire and his increasingly alienated Macedonian core, would erupt into open, sometimes violent conflict in the years that followed. Did you know? Number 12. The introduction of proskynesis at Alexander's court led to one of the most dramatic confrontations of his entire reign. When Alexander attempted to formally require the gesture from his Greek and Macedonian companions, not merely conquered Persians, who were accustomed to such displays toward their kings, the historian Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle who had accompanied the expedition as its official chronicler, publicly refused, arguing that prostration before a mortal man violated fundamental Greek religious and cultural values. The confrontation became a flashpoint for growing unease about Alexander's increasingly autocratic, quasi-divine self-presentation. Callisthenes was later implicated, rightly or wrongly, in a conspiracy against Alexander's life and executed or died in custody. A brutal end for the very historian Alexander had brought along specifically to record his achievements for posterity. Part 12. The Murder of a Friend. Among the darkest episodes of Alexander's later campaigns was an incident that occurred during a drunken banquet in 328 BCE, a moment that reveals, with unusual clarity, the psychological costs that years of continuous warfare, absolute power, and mounting tension with his own closest companions had begun to exact. Cletus the Black, the same companion who had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus River years earlier by cutting off the arm of a Persian nobleman about to deliver a killing blow, had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and what he and other senior Macedonian officers viewed as a dangerous drift toward Eastern-style despotism. During a heavily intoxicated feast, the argument between Alexander and Cletus escalated dramatically. Cletus, by some accounts goaded further by other officers, began openly mocking Alexander's claims to divine parentage and contrasting Alexander's current behavior unfavorably with the achievements of Philip, Alexander's actual father. What happened next has been recorded by multiple ancient sources with remarkable, painful consistency. In a fit of drunken rage, Alexander seized a spear from a nearby guard and killed Cletus, the man who had saved his life years earlier, on the spot. The aftermath was, by every ancient account, devastating to Alexander himself. He reportedly fell into a profound depression lasting several days, refusing food, and according to some sources attempting to turn the spear on himself before being physically restrained by his companions. His court philosophers and advisors eventually persuaded him to resume his duties, offering various philosophical justifications for what had happened, arguments about the inevitability of fate, the particular responsibilities and burdens of kingship, the idea that a king's actions, however terrible, existed in a different moral category than those of ordinary men. Whether these arguments genuinely comforted Alexander or simply provided him a path back to functioning leadership, the incident marked a clear, undeniable turning point. The increasingly isolated, increasingly absolute power Alexander wielded, combined with the psychological toll of years of continuous campaigning, old wounds, and likely serious alcohol dependency, had created a genuinely dangerous instability at the very center of the largest empire on earth. The murder of Cletus stands, even within the broader sweep of Alexander's accomplishments, as one of the most haunting episodes of his entire career, a stark reminder that the same intensity, the same refusal to accept limits, that drove his unprecedented military achievements also carried genuinely destructive potential when turned, in a moment of rage, against those closest to him. Did you know? Number 13. Alexander's relationship with his closest companion, Hyphasis, has been the subject of extensive historical debate for over 2,000 years. Ancient sources describe a bond of extraordinary intimacy and devotion between the two men, dating back to their shared education under Aristotle. When Hyphasis died unexpectedly in 324 BCE, likely from typhoid fever, Alexander's grief was described by ancient historians as something close to madness. He reportedly had Hyphasis's physician executed, ordered an extravagant period of mourning across the entire empire, commissioned an enormous funeral monument, and according to some accounts cut his own hair short in a traditional Greek expression of grief usually reserved for losing a close family member. Whether their relationship was romantic, deeply platonic, or some combination that does not map cleanly onto modern categories remains genuinely debated among historians. What is not in question is that Hyphasis's death devastated Alexander in a way nothing else in his adult life appears to have done, and that he himself would die less than a year later, having never fully recovered from the loss. Part 13. Into India. By 327 BCE, having spent nearly 3 exhausting years subduing Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander turned his attention toward India, territory that, in the Greek geographical understanding of the time, represented something close to the literal eastern edge of the inhabited world. Crossing the formidable Hindu Kush mountain range, his army descended into the Indus River Valley, entering a world of climate, culture, and warfare genuinely unlike anything they had encountered in the Mediterranean or Persian heartlands. The most significant confrontation of the Indian campaign came in 326 BCE, at the Battle of the Hyphasis River, against King Porus, ruler of a substantial kingdom in the Punjab region. Porus commanded something Alexander's army had never faced in battle before, a substantial force of war elephants, animals whose sheer size, unfamiliar smell, and terrifying trumpeting calls had an immediate, visceral effect on Macedonian cavalry horses entirely unaccustomed to them. Alexander, characteristically, adapted his tactics rapidly. Rather than attempting a direct cavalry assault against the elephant line, he used his infantry, equipped with long sarissas, to harry and wound the elephants directly, while his cavalry swept around the flanks of Porus's formation, exploiting gaps that opened as the wounded, panicking elephants began trampling their own ranks in confusion and pain. The battle was, by Alexander's own later account and by the assessment of several ancient historians, among the hardest fought engagements of his entire career, a far closer contest than his previous decisive victories over the Persians. Porus himself, fighting from atop his own war elephant even as his army collapsed around him, was eventually captured. When brought before Alexander and asked how he wished to be treated, Porus reportedly replied simply, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by both his courage in battle and the dignity of his response, restored Porus to his throne as a subject ally rather than treating him as a conquered enemy to be replaced or eliminated. Another example of the increasingly sophisticated, relationship-based approach to governance that defined the later years of Alexander's conquests. Did you know? Number 14. During the Indian campaign, Alexander founded two cities near the site of the Battle of the Hyphasis. 1. Bucephala, was named in honor of his beloved horse Bucephalus, who died shortly after the battle, either from wounds sustained in the fighting or simply from old age and exhaustion, having carried Alexander across thousands of miles of campaigning since Alexander was a teenager. Ancient sources describe Alexander's grief at his horse's death as comparable in intensity to his grief for fallen human companions. A final, telling detail about the depth of loyalty and affection Alexander was capable of feeling, even amid the brutal calculus of continuous warfare. Part 14. The Mutiny at the Hyphasis. After the victory over Porus, Alexander intended to continue pushing further east, driven by reports, likely exaggerated, possibly entirely mythical, of even greater kingdoms and riches lying beyond the edge of his current knowledge, somewhere in the direction of the Ganges River and beyond. His army, however, had reached its absolute limit. By the summer of 326 BCE, Alexander's soldiers had been marching and fighting continuously for 8 years, covering a distance from Macedonia that modern estimates place at somewhere between 10 and 11,000 miles, through deserts, over mountain ranges, across rivers, through monsoon seasons that brought relentless rain and disease, fighting battles against opponents ranging from the most sophisticated army in the ancient world to guerrilla fighters in mountain strongholds too. Most recently, war elephants in conditions utterly foreign to anything in their original training. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, in the Punjab, Alexander's army simply stopped. When Alexander called his officers together to announce his intention to continue advancing, he was met, for the first time in his entire career, with open, organized refusal. The General Coenus, reportedly speaking on behalf of the assembled army, made an impassioned appeal, recorded, with likely significant embellishment, by several ancient historians, describing the exhaustion, the homesickness, The sense that the army had already achieved accomplishments beyond anything any previous force in human history had managed, and that continuing further into unknown, increasingly hostile territory risked everything they had already won. Alexander's response was characteristic of a man who had never, in his entire life, accepted being told no. He retreated to his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, in what ancient sources variously describe as a sulk, a genuine crisis of identity, or a calculated attempt to pressure his officers into reconsidering through the implicit threat of abandoning his command entirely. The army did not relent. After 3 days, Alexander emerged and, according to Arrian, one of the most reliable ancient sources for his campaigns, performed sacrifices that were interpreted as unfavorable for continuing the advance, a face-saving religious justification that allowed him to announce the turn back as the will of the gods rather than a capitulation to his own soldiers' demands. It was the only true defeat of Alexander's entire military career, not on a battlefield, not at the hands of an enemy general, but in a confrontation with the limits of human endurance among the very men who had followed him further than any army in recorded history had ever marched. The return journey proved, in some respects, even more costly than the advance had been. Alexander chose to lead a portion of his forces back through the Gedrosian Desert, in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, a route of such extreme hardship, with temperatures soaring and water sources scarce or poisoned, that ancient sources describe it as costing more lives than any single battle of the entire campaign. Why Alexander chose this brutal route, when easier paths existed, remains debated. Some ancient sources suggest he wished to outdo the legendary Persian queen Semiramis and the god Dionysus, both of whom were said in myth to have crossed the same desert and suffered catastrophic losses. Yet another example of Alexander measuring his own achievements against mythological, rather than merely historical, precedent. If the scale of this journey is starting to feel almost impossible to comprehend, that is, in many ways, the entire point. Few human beings in history have lived a life of this intensity. If you're enjoying following it, Sleep and History has many more stories waiting. A subscribe helps more than you know. Now, to Babylon, and to the end. Did you know number 15? The Gedrosian Desert crossing is estimated by some historians to have cost Alexander's army more casualties than any single battle of his entire career. Potentially tens of thousands of soldiers, along with the camp followers, merchants, and families who traveled with the army, lost to heat, thirst, and a catastrophic flash flood that swept through a camp in a dry river during the night, killing soldiers and non-combatants alike. It remains one of the most devastating non-combat losses suffered by any major army in ancient military history. Part 15. The Return to Babylon. By 324 BCE, Alexander had returned to the heart of his empire, settling in Babylon, the city he appears to have favored as a capital for the vast, multicultural empire he now ruled. An empire stretching, at its absolute maximum extent, from Greece to the borders of India, encompassing dozens of distinct peoples, languages, religions, and political traditions. The final year and a half of Alexander's life was marked by an extraordinary, almost frantic burst of administrative activity, as if he understood, on some level, that time was running short and that the practical work of actually governing the empire he had conquered could not be postponed indefinitely in favor of further military campaigns. He ordered a mass wedding ceremony at Susa, in which he himself, along with dozens of his senior Macedonian officers, married Persian noblewomen in an enormous, deliberately symbolic ceremony intended to physically and literally bind together the Macedonian conquerors and the Persian aristocracy into a single unified ruling class. he began integrating Persian soldiers directly into his previously all-Macedonian elite military units, training 30,000 young Persians in Macedonian military tactics and equipment, a policy that provoked significant resentment among his veteran Macedonian soldiers, who increasingly felt their unique status and privileged position within the empire being diluted. This resentment came to a head at Opis, where Alexander's veteran troops, learning of his plans to send aging and wounded Macedonian soldiers home while continuing to integrate Persian forces, staged an open mutiny, mockingly suggesting Alexander continue his conquests with the help of his new father Amun rather than the Macedonians who had actually fought beside him for over a decade. Alexander's response was swift and characteristically dramatic. He had the ringleaders of the mutiny executed, then, in an extraordinary public reconciliation, addressed the assembled army directly, reminding them of everything Macedonia and his own family had done for them, declaring his intention to discharge them honorably and send them home with extraordinary wealth, and ultimately provoking a tearful, emotional reunion in which the soldiers begged forgiveness and Alexander, according to ancient sources, wept alongside them. It was a final, vivid illustration of the complicated, often contradictory relationship between Alexander and the army that had followed him to the edges of the known world, a relationship built simultaneously on genuine mutual loyalty and increasingly fraught tension over what, exactly, Alexander's vision for the future of his empire actually required of the men who had made that empire possible in the first place. Did you know? Number 16. Among Alexander's final administrative projects was an ambitious plan to fully explore and chart the coastline of the Arabian Peninsula, with the apparent long-term goal of incorporating Arabia into his empire and potentially even extending Macedonian power into North Africa, possibly as far as Carthage. Naval expeditions were already being prepared when Alexander fell ill in the early summer of 323 BCE. Historians have long speculated about what additional conquests Alexander might have attempted had he lived longer. Arabia, Carthage, possibly even a return to finish the conquest of India that his own army had forced him to abandon. We will never know. The plans died with him. Part 16. The death of a god king. In late May or early June of 323 BCE, after attending a series of banquets in Babylon, including one hosted by his companion Medius that involved substantial drinking, in keeping with Macedonian court customs, Alexander began experiencing severe fever and abdominal pain. Over the following days, his condition steadily worsened. He developed a high fever that did not break, increasing weakness, and eventually was unable to speak or move significant portions of his body. The ancient sources describing his final illness are remarkably detailed, likely drawn from what may have been an official royal diary kept by his secretary, recording each day's symptoms with almost clinical precision. A fever on this day, increasing weakness on the next, an inability to speak by a certain point, though Alexander reportedly remained conscious enough to recognize his officers and, according to the most famous account, to raise his hand in silent acknowledgement as his soldiers, fearing he had already died, filed past his sickbed for one final farewell. He died on either the 10th or 11th of June. 323 BCE, in Babylon, at 32 years old. The cause of his death has been debated for over 2,000 years and remains genuinely unresolved. The most widely accepted modern medical theories point toward typhoid fever, possibly complicated by malaria or other infections, combined with the cumulative toll of multiple serious battle wounds, including the arrow that had pierced his lung in India and very nearly killed him years earlier, along with what was very likely significant chronic alcohol consumption. consistent with Macedonian royal court culture and particularly intensified during the stresses of his final years. Other ancient sources, and some modern historians, have not ruled out poisoning. Given the genuine political tensions within Alexander's court, the substantial number of people who stood to benefit from his death, and the simple fact that the symptoms described could be consistent with certain poisons available in the ancient world, the truth will very likely never be definitively known. What is recorded with greater certainty is the question reportedly posed to the dying king, who should inherit his vast empire. Alexander's response, whispered with what little strength remained to him, has echoed through over 2,000 years of history. To the strongest. 3 words. No named heir. No clear succession plan for an empire stretching across 3 continents, encompassing dozens of peoples and languages, held together, ultimately, by nothing more than the personal authority of a single extraordinary individual who had now died without ever fully establishing how that authority should pass to anyone else. It was, in retrospect, possibly the single most consequential power vacuum in ancient history. Did you know? Number 17. Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant at the time of his death and gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. Several months later, a posthumous heir whose existence immediately became one of the central, contested factors in the chaotic struggle for power that followed. The infant king, along with his mother, would be murdered years later, while still a child, by rivals among Alexander's former generals who recognized that as long as a legitimate blood heir survived, their own claims to portions of the fractured empire would remain permanently vulnerable. Neither Alexander's son nor his half-brother Philip III, who briefly held nominal kingship after Alexander's death, would survive the brutal decades of conflict that followed. The bloodline of Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, was entirely extinguished within roughly 15 years of his own death. Part 17. The empire tears itself apart. The 40 years following Alexander's death, known to historians as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors, represent one of the most prolonged, brutal periods of large-scale warfare in ancient history, as Alexander's senior generals, each commanding portions of his former army, fought each other relentlessly for control over the fragments of his empire. There was no clean division, no orderly process. Each of Alexander's generals, men like Ptolemy, who seized control of Egypt and would found a dynasty that lasted 3 centuries, ending only with the death of Cleopatra, Seleucus, who carved out a vast eastern empire stretching from Syria deep into Central Asia, Antigonus, who attempted, unsuccessfully, to reunify the entire empire under his own rule, and several others, fought, allied, betrayed, and fought again across decades of nearly continuous warfare. By the time the dust finally settled, sometime in the early 3rd century BCE, Alexander's unified empire had fractured permanently into several distinct Hellenistic kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid empire stretching across much of the former Persian heartland, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece, and several smaller successor states. None of these kingdoms ever came close to reuniting the full territorial extent of Alexander's original conquests. The dream of a single unified empire, stretching from Greece to India, died with Alexander himself in 323 BCE and was never genuinely revived. And yet, in a deeper sense, what Alexander had actually created proved far more durable than any single political structure could have been. Did you know? Number 18. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted generals and reportedly a childhood friend, secured control of Egypt in the chaotic division of the empire and took an extraordinary step to legitimize his rule. He hijacked Alexander's funeral procession, originally intended to carry the body back to Macedonia for burial, and diverted it instead to Egypt. Alexander's body was eventually interred in Alexandria, the city he himself had founded, becoming both a sacred relic and a powerful symbol of legitimacy for the new Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries. The last ruler of that dynasty, descended through generations of Ptolemaic kings and queens, would be Cleopatra VI, meaning that, in a very direct sense, the woman whose story we have told elsewhere on this channel ruled as the final inheritor of a political lineage that began with Alexander's own conquest of Egypt nearly 3 centuries before her birth. Part 18. What Alexander actually left behind. The true legacy of Alexander the Great is not measured in the political boundaries of an empire that fractured almost immediately upon his death. It is measured in something far more diffuse, and ultimately far more permanent, the spread of Greek language, culture, and ideas across a vast swath of the ancient world, creating what historians call the Hellenistic era, a period lasting roughly 3 centuries, during which Greek became the common language of trade, administration, and intellectual life from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. The cities Alexander founded across his empire, more than 20 of them, most bearing some version of his own name, became centers where Greek settlers, local populations, and ideas from both traditions mixed and produced genuinely new forms of art, philosophy, religion, and science. Alexandria in Egypt became home to the Great Library, an institution that attempted, for the first time in human history, to systematically collect and preserve the entire accumulated written knowledge of the ancient world, and to the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships into its harbor for centuries. Greek mathematics, philosophy, and medicine spread eastward along trade routes secured, in their initial stages, by Alexander's conquests, eventually influencing intellectual traditions as far away as India. When early Christian writers, several centuries after Alexander's death, sought a language in which to write the New Testament for the widest possible audience across the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, they chose Greek, the common language that Alexander's conquests had spread across exactly the territories where Christianity would first take root and spread. The cultural and linguistic infrastructure Alexander's conquests created, in other words, directly shaped the environment in which one of history's most influential religious movements would later emerge and spread. This is the deeper, more complicated truth about Alexander's legacy. The political empire he built collapsed almost immediately, torn apart by his own generals within a generation of his death. But the cultural and linguistic transformation his conquest set in motion, the spread of Greek ideas, language, and culture across an enormous swath of the ancient world, proved far more durable, shaping the intellectual and religious development of Western civilization for centuries after the political map of his empire had been entirely redrawn, redrawn again, and redrawn once more. Part 19. The man behind the myth. After everything, the battles, the conquests, the cities founded and the cities destroyed, the extraordinary triumphs and the genuinely dark episodes of violence against his own closest companions, what can we actually say about who Alexander truly was? The historical record itself is complicated by the fact that Alexander became a legend almost immediately after his death, with later writers, propagandists, and storytellers across multiple civilizations and centuries adding layers of embellishment, moralizing, and outright invention to his story. The Alexander Romance, a heavily fictionalized account that began circulating within a few centuries of his death, transformed him into a figure of pure legend, attributing to him fantastical journeys to the bottom of the sea in a glass diving bell, conversations with talking trees, and battles against monstrous creatures that bear no relationship whatsoever to anything in the more reliable historical accounts. Even setting aside these later fictional embellishments and relying only on the more historically grounded ancient sources, Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, Quintus Curtius Rufus, each writing centuries after Alexander's actual life and each with their own particular biases and agendas, the man who emerges remains genuinely difficult to summarize in simple terms. He was, by any measure, one of the most brilliant military commanders in human history, a man who never lost a major battle despite frequently facing forces that significantly outnumbered his own, who combined tactical innovation with personal physical courage in a way that inspired extraordinary loyalty from the soldiers who followed him across thousands of miles of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. He was also capable of genuine, sustained cruelty, the destruction of Thebes, the brutal punishment of Tyre after its prolonged resistance, the murder of his friend Cletus in a moment of drunken rage, acts that, however explicable within the brutal political and military logic of the ancient world, cannot simply be erased from any honest accounting of his life. He held a genuine, evolving vision of cultural integration that was, in many ways, remarkably progressive for his era. The marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, the integration of conquered peoples into his administration and eventually his military, the respect he showed to defeated enemies and their families. And yet this same vision was inseparable from an increasingly absolute, increasingly autocratic conception of his own authority that alienated many of his closest, most loyal companions. He believed, with what appears to have been genuine sincerity rather than mere political calculation, that he might be at least partially divine, the son of Zeus, confirmed by the Egyptian oracle as the son of Amun, even as he simultaneously embodied, through his education under Aristotle, some of the most rigorous rational and philosophical thinking the Greek world had ever produced. He was, in short, almost impossibly contradictory, simultaneously rational and mystical, generous and brutal, visionary and destructive, beloved by his soldiers and, in his final years, increasingly isolated from the very companions who had known him longest. Perhaps this is precisely why his story has continued to captivate, to be told and retold, for more than 2,000 years. He cannot be reduced to a simple hero or a simple villain. He remains, even now, a figure who resists easy categorization, which is, in the end, perhaps the truest reflection of how complicated human ambition, genius, and flaw can become when given the power to remake the entire known world according to one young man's restless, unsatisfiable vision of what he might become. Epilogue. The deserts he crossed are still there. More than 2,300 years have passed since Alexander died in Babylon at 32 years old. The empire he built fractured within a generation. The cities he founded have mostly vanished, absorbed into later settlements or lost entirely beneath centuries of accumulated history. The language he spread across half the known world evolved and changed, giving way eventually to other tongues, other empires, other civilizations entirely. And yet, walk through the ruins of Persepolis today, and you can still see the marks of the fire that consumed it on a single night in 330 BCE. Stand on the peninsula where the island city of Tyre once stood, and you are standing on a land bridge that exists only because a 24-year-old king refused to accept that a half-mile of open sea could stop his army. Visit Alexandria, Egypt, and you are walking through a city whose street plan, according to legend, was first sketched in barley flour by Alexander's own hand, nearly 2,500 years ago. His tomb, somewhere beneath the modern streets of that same city, has never been found. A final, fitting mystery for a man who spent his entire life refusing to accept the boundaries of what was supposed to be possible. He conquered more territory, more quickly, than perhaps any individual in human history before or since. He marched an army further than anyone had ever marched one. He never lost a battle. And he died at 32, having achieved more than most rulers manage across an entire lifetime 3 or 4 times as long, leaving behind a legend so powerful that conquerors and kings for the next 2,000 years, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and countless others, would measure their own ambitions against his, and find themselves, every time, falling short. The deserts he crossed are still there. The mountains he climbed are still there. The cities he founded, those that survived, still stand. And somewhere in the story of a king who never stopped moving, who never accepted that anything was truly impossible, who burned as brightly and as briefly as any human being in recorded history, there is something that has never quite stopped speaking to us, across all the centuries since his death. A restless hunger to know what lies beyond the next horizon. A refusal to accept the limits other people insist are real. And the genuine, terrible cost, to himself, and to everyone around him, of never, ever being able to stop. If this story has carried you somewhere peaceful tonight, somewhere thoughtful, somewhere quiet enough to finally close your eyes, subscribe to Sleep and History, where the past becomes your most restful companion, and where stories like this one are waiting for you, every week, to carry you gently into sleep. Rest well.